Before we descend into the shadows of Federal Hill, I want to know who's walking this road with me tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right where you are. Are you riding home in the dark? Winding down before bed with the lights low? Let me know, because where you are changes nothing about where we're going. We're going back. Back to the smoke-filled backrooms, the diners, the tenements of Providence, and the long, patient rise of a man who ruled an empire without ever needing to shout. Long before Raymond Patriarca became a name that federal prosecutors would spend 3 decades trying to pin down, before he was the acknowledged boss of the New England crime family, before his name was whispered in fear from the wharves of Providence to the back alleys of Boston's North End, he was just a boy. A boy born into hardship, in a country still finding its footing, in an era when the promise of America was as much a lie as it was a hope for the thousands of immigrants pouring into its industrial cities. Raymond Loretta Salvatore Patriarca was born on March 17, 1908, in Worcester, Massachusetts. His parents, like so many others in that generation, had come from Italy, specifically from the region around Naples, chasing the same dream that drew millions across the Atlantic, a better life, steady work, a future for their children that didn't involve the crushing poverty of the old country. What they found instead, in the mill towns and factory cities of New England, was often a different kind of poverty, one dressed up in American clothes but no less punishing. Long hours in factories. Cramped tenement housing. Discrimination that followed Italian immigrants like a shadow, branding them as criminals, as diseased, as unworthy of the American promise before they'd even had the chance to prove otherwise. This was the world that shaped young Raymond. Worcester in the early 1900s was a city of contradictions, a booming industrial center, filled with wire mills and machine shops, and yet also a city where ethnic enclaves lived in a state of constant tension. The Italians clustered together for protection and community, the Irish held their own turf, and the older Yankee establishment looked down on both with the kind of quiet contempt that never needed to be spoken aloud to be felt. If you were an Italian kid growing up in Worcester in the 1910s, you learned early that the system wasn't built for you. You learned that the police, more often than not, saw your neighborhood as a place to be watched rather than protected. You learned who to trust, and it usually wasn't anyone wearing a badge. The Patriarca family eventually made its way to Providence, Rhode Island, a city that would become inseparable from Raymond's name for the rest of his life. Providence, in the years following World War I, was a rough, working-class port city, its economy built on textiles, jewelry manufacturing, and the kind of blue-collar grit that produced tough, street-smart kids who learned to survive by their wits. And on the streets of Federal Hill, the historic Italian-American neighborhood that would later become synonymous with organized crime in New England, young Raymond Patriarca began to learn the lessons that would define the rest of his life. We don't have detailed records of Raymond's early childhood the way we might for a public figure who was celebrated rather than surveilled. Much of what we know about his youth comes through the lens of later investigations, court testimony, and the recollections, sometimes embellished, sometimes deliberately vague, of people who knew him or claimed to. But the broad strokes are clear enough. Raymond Patriarca did not have the luxury of a comfortable childhood. He grew up fast, in a world where toughness was currency, where a reputation for being unafraid was worth more than any dollar in your pocket, and where the lines between legitimate hustle and criminal enterprise were blurred by necessity as much as by choice. By his teenage years, Raymond had already begun brushing against the criminal underworld that would come to define his existence. This was Prohibition-era America, a period when the federal government's attempt to legislate morality created, almost overnight, one of the most lucrative black markets in the nation's history. Bootlegging wasn't just a crime in the 1920s, for thousands of young men in cities like Providence, it was an industry, a career path, a way to make more money in a month than their fathers made in a year of honest factory labor. And for ambitious young men who had grown up poor, who had grown up angry at a system that seemed designed to keep them poor, the temptation was overwhelming. Raymond Patriarca did not resist that temptation. If anything, he embraced it with a kind of calculated intensity that would come to define his entire career. Unlike some of his contemporaries, who saw bootlegging purely as a chance for quick, flashy money, fast cars, fine clothes, the kind of ostentatious display of wealth that eventually got so many of them killed or imprisoned. Raymond approached the business with something closer to strategic patience. Even as a young man, he seemed to understand a truth that would separate him from countless other gangsters who flared bright and burned out fast. Survival in this world wasn't about being the loudest or the flashiest. It was about being useful, being reliable, and being smart enough to know when to strike and when to wait. His first serious brushes with the law came in the late 1920s and early 1930s, a string of arrests that painted a picture of a young man deeply entangled in the underworld economy of bootlegging, robbery, and the kind of violent enforcement that kept criminal operations running smoothly. Records from this period show Raymond facing charges ranging from receiving stolen goods to assault, and by the early 1930s, he had already developed a reputation on the streets of Providence as someone not to be trifled with, a young man who could be counted on to handle problems, quietly and effectively, without drawing unnecessary attention. It was during this formative period that Raymond began to attract the notice of more established figures in the New England underworld. Organized crime in this era was still finding its structure, the elaborate mafia hierarchies that would later become infamous, with their bosses and underbosses and consiglieres, were only beginning to solidify into the form that later generations would recognize. In cities across the Northeast, ambitious criminals were consolidating smaller gangs into larger, more disciplined organizations, borrowing structural ideas from the old-world Sicilian and Neapolitan criminal societies their families had left behind, while adapting them to the unique opportunities and challenges of American cities. Providence, with its port access, its dense Italian-American community, and its relatively compact size compared to giants like New York or Chicago, was uniquely positioned to develop a tight-knit, insular criminal organization, one where a small number of trusted men could exert enormous control over the city's illegal economy without the chaos and internal warfare that plagued larger criminal enterprises elsewhere. And Raymond Patriarca, with his combination of street toughness, quiet intelligence, and an instinct for loyalty that impressed the older men who were watching him, was exactly the kind of young talent that this emerging organization needed. By the mid-1930s, Raymond had become a known and rising figure within Providence's Italian-American criminal underworld. He was building relationships, not just with fellow criminals, but, crucially, with corrupt police officers, local politicians, and business owners who found it more convenient to cooperate with the underworld than to fight it. This was perhaps one of Raymond's earliest and most important lessons, one he would carry with him for the rest of his career. Organized crime doesn't survive on violence alone. It survives on relationships. It survives on the careful cultivation of people in positions of legitimate power who are willing, for money, for fear, or for some mixture of both, to look the other way. Prohibition ended in 1933, and with it came the collapse of the bootlegging economy that had provided the financial foundation for so many criminal careers of that era. For many gangsters, the end of Prohibition meant the end of easy money, and the underworld saw a period of violent reshuffling as criminal organizations scrambled to find new sources of illegal revenue. Gambling operations expanded. Loan sharking became increasingly organized and increasingly brutal. And the rackets that had once operated on the fringes of legitimate business began to burrow deeper into the legal economy, extortion of local businesses, corrupt labor union practices, and the slow, patient infiltration of legitimate commerce that would eventually make organized crime almost impossible to fully separate from ordinary economic life in cities like Providence. Raymond Patriarca adapted. This was, perhaps, the single defining characteristic of his entire career, not raw violence, though he was capable of that when necessary, and not flashy charisma, though he possessed a quiet magnetism that drew loyalty from those around him, but adaptability. He watched which criminal enterprises were dying and which were rising, and he positioned himself accordingly. Throughout the 1930s, he built connections in the gambling world, which was rapidly becoming one of the most lucrative, and most protected, criminal enterprises in New England. Illegal betting on horse races, numbers games in working-class neighborhoods, high-stakes card games for the wealthy, all of it required organization, protection, and a network of people willing to collect debts and enforce rules without involving the police. Raymond built exactly that kind of reputation. It was also during this period that Raymond's legal troubles began to mount more seriously. In 1938, he faced one of the more consequential arrests of his early career, related to charges that would follow him, and would later be used against him, for years afterward. The specifics of these early legal battles reveal a pattern that would define his entire relationship with the American justice system. Raymond Patriarca was arrested with striking frequency throughout his life, and yet convictions that actually stuck, that actually resulted in significant prison time, were remarkably rare given the scale of his criminal activities. This wasn't luck. This was the result of a carefully cultivated system of influence, bribed officials, intimidated witnesses, and a code of silence among his associates that federal investigators would spend decades trying and largely failing to crack. By the time World War II arrived, Raymond Patriarca was no longer just a promising young enforcer on the streets of Providence. He had become a made man, a full, initiated member of the Italian-American organized crime structure that was solidifying across the Northeast. The exact circumstances of his formal induction into what would become known as the Patriarca crime family are shrouded in the same secrecy that surrounded so much of organized crime's internal workings, but by the early 1940s, Raymond's name carried weight. He was no longer someone who worked for others, he was becoming someone whom others worked for. The war years themselves brought both challenges and opportunities for organized crime in America. Many young men, including plenty of criminals and criminal associates, were drafted or enlisted, temporarily disrupting the workforce that fueled illegal enterprises. But the war also created new black market opportunities. Rationing of goods like gasoline, sugar, meat, and rubber created enormous demand for illegally acquired and distributed goods, and organized crime networks across the country, including in New England, were quick to capitalize. Raymond, it appears from historical records, avoided military service. Accounts suggest health-related deferments, though the details remain murky, as so much of his life does, and instead spent the war years consolidating his position within the Providence underworld, expanding his network, and deepening the relationships that would soon propel him to the very top of New England's criminal hierarchy. What made Raymond different from so many of his contemporaries, the loud, violent, self-destructive gangsters who dominated headlines and then vanished into prison cells or early graves, was his growing understanding that real power in the underworld required more than just fear. It required trust. It required the kind of quiet reliability that made other criminals want to work with you rather than around you. Throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, Raymond Patriarca built a reputation not just as a man who could be dangerous, but as a man whose word meant something, a man who settled disputes fairly, who paid what he owed, who protected those loyal to him and dealt swiftly and permanently with those who betrayed him. This reputation, built patiently over more than a decade of criminal apprenticeship on the unforgiving streets of Providence, was about to be tested. Because in the years following World War II, a power vacuum was opening up in the New England underworld, a vacuum created by the death, imprisonment, or fading influence of an older generation of Italian-American crime bosses. And Raymond Patriarca, the quiet, watchful boy from Worcester who had learned every hard lesson the streets of Federal Hill had to teach him, was about to make his move, not with a dramatic, bloody coup that would announce his ambitions to the world, but with the same careful, patient strategy that had brought him this far. He was about to become the man that all of New England's underworld would answer to. But that story, the story of his rise to the very top, of the alliances he forged and the enemies he crushed, of the moment Raymond Patriarca stopped being a rising player and became the undisputed boss of an entire region's criminal empire, that is a story for our next chapter. By the late 1940s, the underworld of New England was a landscape in flux, and landscapes in flux are dangerous places to be ambitious in. The old guard that had ruled the Italian-American criminal networks of Providence and Boston throughout Prohibition and the years immediately following it was fading, some through age, some through the slow erosion of influence that comes when a man spends too many years behind bars, and some through the simple, brutal arithmetic of underworld politics, where rivals do not always wait for nature to clear a path. Into this vacuum stepped a generation of younger, hungrier men, each of them believing, in the quiet arrogance that so often precedes a fall, that they were the one destined to inherit what was left behind. Raymond Patriarca was among them. But Raymond understood something that many of his rivals did not: in a vacuum, the man who survives is rarely the one who moves fastest. He is the one who moves last, and only when the outcome is already certain. Providence in this era was still very much a divided criminal territory. Various factions controlled different rackets, different neighborhoods, different slices of the enormous illegal economy that ran beneath the surface of ordinary New England life, the gambling parlors tucked behind unmarked doors, the numbers runners who moved through working-class neighborhoods collecting bets as casually as a mailman delivered letters, the loan sharks who extended credit to desperate men and women at interest rates that could ruin a family in months. Raymond had spent the better part of 2 decades building relationships across these factions, and it was this web of connections, carefully, patiently constructed, that would prove to be his greatest asset as the old order began to collapse. One of the most significant developments in Raymond's rise during this period was his deepening relationship with organized crime networks beyond Rhode Island's borders, particularly in Boston, where a separate but closely intertwined criminal ecosystem operated, and in New York, where the 5 families exercised an influence that touched criminal operations across the entire Northeast corridor. Raymond understood, perhaps better than any of his New England contemporaries, that true power in this world could not be built in isolation. A boss who controlled only his own city was vulnerable to rivals who could call in outside muscle, vulnerable to the whims of larger organizations who might decide his territory was worth taking. But a boss who had the respect and backing of the major crime families in New York, who had proven himself reliable and useful to the larger national criminal syndicate that was solidifying in this era, that boss was untouchable, or as close to untouchable as anyone in this line of work could hope to be. Raymond began cultivating exactly these kinds of relationships throughout the 1940s. He was known to travel to New York periodically, meeting with figures connected to the major families, building the kind of personal trust that couldn't be established through intermediaries or reputation alone. This was slow, unglamorous work, none of the dramatic gunfights or public displays of dominance that Hollywood would later attach to gangster mythology. It was dinners in quiet restaurants. It was favors extended and favors remembered. It was the careful, almost diplomatic work of a man building alliances the way a politician builds a coalition, understanding that in this world, just as in any other, power flows toward those who make themselves indispensable to as many people as possible. By 1952, Raymond Patriarca's position had solidified to the point where he was widely recognized, both by law enforcement and by his fellow criminals, as the dominant figure in Rhode Island's organized crime landscape, and increasingly, as one of the most powerful figures in the broader New England underworld that stretched from Providence up through Boston and into parts of Connecticut. This was the year that many historians and investigators point to as the moment Raymond truly ascended to the position that would define the rest of his life, boss of what would come to be known, in FBI files and later in popular history, as the Patriarca crime family, an organization that, at its height, would exercise influence over illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and a dozen other criminal enterprises across the entirety of New England. What set Raymond's ascension apart from so many of the bloody successions that defined organized crime in other American cities was its relative quiet. There was no headline-grabbing gang war, no string of public assassinations that announced a changing of the guard to the newspapers and to a horrified public. This was, in many ways, the essential genius of Raymond Patriarca's entire approach to power. He understood that visible violence attracted attention, and attention was the enemy of longevity in this business. The bosses who made the papers, who became household names through spectacular violence, were the bosses who ended up dead or in prison within a few short years. Raymond intended to be different. He intended to rule for decades, not years, and he understood from the very beginning that the price of that longevity was discipline, discipline in violence, discipline in visibility, discipline in every aspect of how he conducted himself and his organization. This is not to say that Raymond's rise was bloodless. Organized crime does not function on politeness alone, and there is substantial historical evidence, gathered through decades of law enforcement investigation and later corroborated by informants and turncoats who eventually cooperated with federal prosecutors, that Raymond ordered and personally sanctioned numerous acts of violence throughout his consolidation of power, beatings, disappearances, and murders of rivals who refused to fall in line or who posed a genuine threat to his authority. But these acts of violence were, by design, surgical rather than spectacular. They happened quietly. Bodies, when they turned up at all, turned up without fanfare, without the kind of public message sending that other criminal organizations favored. Raymond preferred his enemies to simply vanish from the landscape, their absence a quiet warning to anyone paying close attention, rather than a public spectacle that would draw unwanted police scrutiny and public outrage. By the mid-1950s, Raymond had established what would become the enduring symbol of his reign, a modest, unassuming office on Federal Hill, in the heart of Providence's Italian-American neighborhood. This office, located above a vending machine company that served, at least on paper, as Raymond's legitimate business front, would become one of the most surveilled and infamous locations in the history of American organized crime. It was here, in this cramped, unremarkable room, that Raymond Patriarca would conduct the business of running an empire for the better part of 3 decades. Not from a mansion. Not from a penthouse. Not from any of the ostentatious trappings that lesser men in his position might have surrounded themselves with. From a plain office above a vending machine company, in a working-class Italian neighborhood, where he could walk to a local restaurant for lunch and greet his neighbors by name. This choice, and it was very much a deliberate choice, not an accident of circumstance, reveals something essential about Raymond Patriarca's understanding of power. He grasped, with a clarity that eluded so many of his contemporaries in organized crime, that the appearance of humility could be a more effective shield than any amount of visible wealth or luxury. A boss who lived in a mansion, who drove flashy cars, who wore expensive jewelry, invited scrutiny. He invited jealousy from rivals, invited the kind of public attention that made federal investigators' jobs easier, invited the sort of conspicuous consumption that eventually became evidence in court. Raymond, by contrast, cultivated an image of almost ascetic simplicity. He dressed modestly. He drove unremarkable cars. He lived, by most accounts, a relatively restrained personal life, at least in terms of outward display. And this restraint, this deliberate refusal to flaunt the enormous wealth and power he actually possessed, became one of the central pillars of his ability to survive and thrive for as long as he did. The office on Federal Hill became something of a legend in law enforcement circles almost from the moment Raymond began using it as his base of operations. FBI agents and Rhode Island State Police investigators began surveillance operations on the building, watching the steady stream of visitors who came and went, local politicians, police officials, businessmen, and known criminal figures from across New England, all of them making the pilgrimage to that small office to seek Raymond's counsel, his permission, or his blessing for whatever enterprise they were pursuing. It became understood, in both the criminal underworld and increasingly in law enforcement circles, that almost nothing of significance happened in New England's illegal economy, and, disturbingly, a fair amount of its legal economy as well, without Raymond Patriarca's knowledge and, more often than not, his explicit approval. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Raymond's reign, and the aspect that most distinguished him from the more one-dimensional gangster archetypes that populate popular imagination, the sheer scope of his influence, extending far beyond the traditional boundaries of organized crime into the machinery of legitimate governance itself. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, investigations would repeatedly uncover evidence suggesting that Raymond maintained relationships with police officials, judges, and elected politicians throughout Rhode Island, relationships built on decades of favors, bribes, and mutual convenience. This wasn't corruption in the crude sense of simple bribery for specific favors, though that certainly occurred. It was something more sophisticated and more dangerous, a kind of parallel governance structure, where Raymond Patriarca's approval or disapproval could influence outcomes in the legitimate world just as surely as it dictated outcomes in the criminal underworld. Consider what this meant in practical terms. A police officer who wanted a promotion might find that promotion easier to secure if he had, at some point, done a quiet favor for one of Raymond's associates. A judge facing a difficult re-election campaign might find unexpected support materializing from sources connected, however indirectly, to Raymond's network. A local businessman struggling to secure a contract or a permit might discover that a conversation with the right intermediary, someone who could speak to Raymond, who had Raymond's ear, could smooth the path considerably. None of this required Raymond to personally threaten anyone, to personally hand over bags of cash in dark alleys, though certainly bribery in its more traditional forms occurred as well throughout his reign. What it required was the patient cultivation of relationships and obligations over years and decades, until an entire ecosystem of favors and loyalties had grown up around him, an ecosystem so deeply embedded in the ordinary functioning of Rhode Island public life that untangling it would prove to be one of the great challenges facing federal and state investigators for the rest of the century. It was during this period of consolidation, in the mid to late 1950s, that Raymond also began to solidify the internal structure of his organization, the Patriarca crime family, as it would come to be known in the annals of organized crime history. Unlike the sprawling, multi-hundred-member organizations that characterized the five families of New York, the Patriarca family operated on a somewhat smaller, tighter scale, better suited to the size of the New England territory it controlled. But what it lacked in sheer numbers, it made up for in discipline and cohesion, qualities that Raymond, with his instinctive understanding of organizational loyalty, cultivated with tremendous care. Beneath Raymond, a structure of capos, soldiers, and associates extended across Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and into parts of Connecticut, each layer of the hierarchy responsible for specific territories, specific rackets, specific streams of illegal revenue that ultimately flowed upward, in the form of tribute and respect, to the man in the small office above the vending machine company. Boston, in particular, represented both an opportunity and a persistent challenge throughout Raymond's reign, a city with its own deep criminal traditions, its own factions and rivalries, including the Irish-American criminal networks that would later produce figures like Whitey Bulger, whose own rise to power would occur partly in cooperation with, and partly in tension against, the Italian-American criminal structure that Raymond commanded. Managing this delicate balance, extending his authority into Boston's criminal ecosystem without triggering the kind of ethnic and territorial warfare that had devastated other American cities, required exactly the kind of patient, calculating diplomacy that had defined Raymond's rise from the very beginning. The rackets themselves, during this golden era of Raymond's power throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, were staggeringly lucrative. Illegal gambling remained the backbone of the operation, numbers games that took in small daily bets from thousands of working-class residents across the region, high-stakes card games and dice games that catered to wealthier clientele, and increasingly sophisticated sports betting operations that took advantage of the growing American obsession with professional and college athletics. Loan sharking operated as a kind of shadow banking system for those who couldn't or wouldn't seek credit through legitimate channels, desperate small business owners, compulsive gamblers who had already lost more than they could afford, ordinary people caught in financial emergencies who found themselves borrowing at interest rates that bordered on the medieval, and who then found themselves trapped in cycles of debt that could last years, enforced by the implicit and sometimes explicit threat of violence that hung over every unpaid balance. Labor racketeering, too, became an increasingly important part of Raymond's empire during this period, as organized crime figures across the country recognized the enormous financial opportunities embedded in influence over labor unions, control over pension funds, the ability to extort businesses through the threat of labor strife, the leverage that came from controlling who worked and who didn't in key industries. Raymond's organization developed relationships, some more overt than others, with various union locals throughout New England, extending his influence yet further into the machinery of ordinary economic life. And yet, for all this growing wealth and power, Raymond Patriarca maintained his characteristic discipline. He did not flaunt his fortune. He did not attract the kind of public attention that had doomed so many of his contemporaries. He continued to eat at the same modest restaurants on Federal Hill, to greet the same neighbors, to project the same image of a humble, unremarkable businessman even as federal investigators increasingly came to understand that they were dealing with one of the most powerful organized crime figures in the entire country. This growing federal attention, in fact, represents one of the defining tensions of Raymond's life throughout this period. Even as he consolidated his power throughout the 1950s, the FBI and other federal agencies were beginning to take serious notice of the Patriarca organization. J. Edgar Hoover, the legendary and controversial director of the FBI, had for years been notoriously reluctant to acknowledge the existence of a nationally coordinated Italian-American organized crime network, preferring instead to focus federal law enforcement resources on communism and other perceived threats to American security. But this reluctance began to crack in November 1957, when a meeting of major organized crime figures from across the country was famously interrupted by state police in the small town of Appalachian, New York, an event that would send shockwaves through American law enforcement and force a fundamental reckoning with the reality that a sophisticated, interconnected national criminal organization did, in fact, exist, and did, in fact, pose a serious threat to American institutions. Raymond Patriarca, though not present at the Appalachian meeting itself, was deeply affected by its aftermath. The exposure of that meeting, and the wave of investigative attention it triggered across the country, marked a turning point in how federal and state law enforcement approached organized crime generally, and it placed increasing pressure on regional bosses like Raymond to operate with even greater caution than before. Surveillance intensified. Wiretaps, still in their relatively early technological stages but growing increasingly sophisticated, began to target the office on Federal Hill and the phones of Raymond's known associates. The quiet king was beginning to feel, for the first time in his career, the weight of an American law enforcement apparatus that was finally beginning to understand exactly what it was dealing with. But Raymond, ever the patient strategist, adapted once again. He grew even more careful in how he communicated, relying increasingly on trusted intermediaries to relay messages and instructions rather than speaking directly on phones he suspected, correctly, as it would turn out, were being monitored. He became famous, in later FBI transcripts and investigative accounts, for his habit of writing brief notes or speaking only in the most cryptic, coded language when discussing anything of consequence, forcing investigators to spend enormous resources trying to decipher conversations that often amounted to little more than a few gnomic sentences about taking care of things, or making sure everyone understood. By the early 1960s, Raymond Patriarca stood at the absolute peak of his power. He commanded an organization that stretched across multiple states, that had woven itself into the fabric of legitimate political and economic life throughout Rhode Island and beyond, and that generated wealth on a scale that few outside his innermost circle could fully appreciate. He had achieved what so few men in his line of work ever managed to achieve. He had become, in every meaningful sense, untouchable, not through the crude application of fear alone, though fear was certainly part of his arsenal, but through decades of patient relationship building, careful discipline, and an almost preternatural understanding of how to wield power without drawing the kind of attention that destroyed lesser men. And yet, as anyone who has studied the long, brutal history of organized crime in America knows, no throne remains uncontested forever. No king, however careful, however disciplined, however quiet, rules without eventually facing challenges, from ambitious subordinates who begin to chafe under his authority, from rival organizations who see opportunity in even the smallest sign of weakness, and, perhaps most dangerously of all, from a federal government that was rapidly developing new tools, new legal strategies, and a new generation of prosecutors determined to bring men like Raymond Patriarca to justice, no matter how many decades it might take. The 1960s would bring challenges that even Raymond's formidable patience and cunning would struggle to fully contain. Internal tensions within his own organization, the first serious legal battles that threatened to finally put him behind bars for a meaningful length of time, and the beginning of a slow, grinding war of attrition between the quiet king of Federal Hill and a federal law enforcement apparatus that had finally, after decades of institutional denial, turned its full attention toward dismantling the empire he had spent his entire adult life building. Power, once fully consolidated, brings with it a peculiar kind of vulnerability that men rarely anticipate in the years spent clawing their way toward it. When Raymond Patriarca was still climbing, still a capable lieutenant building alliances, still a rising boss consolidating territory, he was, in many ways, easier to overlook. Ambitious men on the way up rarely draw the same intensity of institutional scrutiny as men who have already arrived, already proven themselves indispensable to an entire criminal ecosystem, already become, in the eyes of the law, a symbol worth toppling. By the early 1960s, Raymond had become exactly that kind of symbol. He was no longer merely a powerful man in Rhode Island's underworld. He had become, in the eyes of federal prosecutors increasingly determined to make their names by dismantling organized crime, the single most important target in all of New England, a man whose downfall, they believed, would send shockwaves through the entire national criminal syndicate. The early 1960s marked a fundamental shift in how the United States government approached organized crime, and this shift would come to define the remainder of Raymond Patriarca's life. For decades, as we've discussed, the federal government's response to organized crime had been inconsistent at best, actively obstructive at worst. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had spent years denying the existence of any coordinated national criminal syndicate, preferring instead to pour resources into the pursuit of communist infiltration and other perceived ideological threats. But the shockwaves from the Appalachian meeting in 1957, combined with a new generation of political leadership that recognized organized crime as a genuine and urgent national problem, began to change the calculus in Washington. Robert F. Kennedy, appointed Attorney General by his brother President John F. Kennedy in 1961, arrived in office with an almost obsessive determination to take down organized crime figures across the country. Kennedy had cut his teeth as a young Senate staffer investigating labor racketeering and organized crime's infiltration of American unions, and he carried into the Justice Department a genuine, deeply held conviction that the Mafia represented one of the most serious threats to American institutions of his era. Under Kennedy's direction, the Justice Department dramatically expanded its resources devoted to organized crime investigation and prosecution, creating specialized units, pushing for expanded wiretapping authority, and pressuring the FBI, often against Hoover's own institutional resistance, to take the threat far more seriously than it ever had before. Raymond Patriarca, sitting in his modest office above the vending machine company on Federal Hill, found himself squarely in the crosshairs of this new federal determination. Rhode Island State Police, working increasingly in coordination with federal investigators, had already been building files on Raymond for years, but the intensity of surveillance directed at him and his organization increased dramatically throughout the early 1960s. Wiretaps multiplied. Informants were cultivated with greater urgency and greater resources than ever before. And perhaps most significantly, investigators began to develop a far more sophisticated understanding of how Raymond's organization actually functioned, an understanding that would eventually prove instrumental in finally securing convictions against him. One of the most consequential developments of this period was the FBI's use of an informant embedded within Raymond's inner circle, a source who provided investigators with an unprecedented window into the internal workings of the Patriarca organization. For years, law enforcement had understood, in broad strokes, that Raymond commanded significant criminal influence throughout New England, but they had struggled to translate that broad understanding into the kind of specific, actionable evidence needed to secure convictions in court. The information flowing from within Raymond's own circle began to change that, providing details about the organization's structure, its methods, and crucially, its involvement in specific criminal acts that could potentially be prosecuted. The pressure on Raymond during this period was not merely legal, it was also deeply personal and organizational. Running a criminal empire the size of the one Raymond commanded required, above all else, the absolute loyalty and discipline of everyone beneath him. A single weak link, a single subordinate who might crack under the pressure of federal investigation or the temptation of a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation, represented an existential threat to the entire structure Raymond had spent decades building. This reality forced Raymond to become even more vigilant, even more careful about who he trusted and how much information any single person within his organization was allowed to possess. The atmosphere within the Patriarca family, by all later accounts, grew increasingly tense throughout this period, a climate of suspicion and careful compartmentalization that stood in sharp contrast to the confident, expansive power Raymond had wielded just a few years earlier. It was against this backdrop of intensifying federal pressure that one of the most consequential episodes of Raymond's criminal career unfolded, a case that would eventually become known, in the annals of organized crime prosecution, as one of the pivotal moments that finally began to crack the shield of untouchability Raymond had constructed around himself over 3 decades. In 1966, Raymond Patriarca was indicted and subsequently convicted on charges related to conspiracy to commit murder, stemming from his role in ordering a hit on a man named Willie Mafia. In April 1966, Willie Mafia was shot and killed in a Providence restaurant, a public execution carried out with the kind of brazen confidence that suggested his killers believed themselves protected from any real consequence. Investigators, building on years of accumulated intelligence about the Patriarca organization's structure and operations, worked to trace the murder back to Raymond himself, building a case that Raymond had ordered the killing as punishment for Mafio's unauthorized operations and his public disrespect. This was precisely the kind of case that federal and state prosecutors had been struggling for years to build, not a case based on general reputation or circumstantial association, but a specific, prosecutable conspiracy charge tied directly to a specific criminal act. The trial that followed was a significant moment in the long history of prosecutorial attempts to bring Raymond to justice. For years, Raymond had cultivated a reputation for being essentially unprosecutable, protected by a combination of witness intimidation, corrupted officials, and simply the difficulty of building airtight cases against a man who insulated himself so carefully from direct involvement in criminal acts. But the case against him in the Mafia conspiracy proved strong enough to secure a conviction. In 1968, Raymond Patriarca was convicted of conspiracy to murder and sentenced to prison, a sentence of 10 years, later modified, that represented one of the most significant legal setbacks of his entire criminal career. For a man who had spent nearly 4 decades building and protecting an empire specifically designed to keep him beyond the reach of the law, this conviction represented a profound rupture. It was proof, both to Raymond himself and to every ambitious rival watching from the shadows of New England's underworld, that the Quiet King was not, in fact, invincible. Prison sentences in organized crime carry a weight that extends far beyond the simple deprivation of freedom. They represent, in the brutal calculus of underworld politics, a moment of demonstrated vulnerability, a crack in the armor that rivals and ambitious subordinates alike would inevitably probe and test. Raymond entered prison in 1970, beginning a period of incarceration that would remove him from direct day-to-day control of his organization for several years. This absence created exactly the kind of power vacuum that Raymond had spent his entire career trying to prevent, a vacuum that his most trusted lieutenants would need to navigate carefully, maintaining the discipline and structure of the organization even without their boss present to enforce it directly. Raymond, ever the strategic thinker even from behind prison walls, worked to ensure that the transition would be as seamless as possible, relying on a small circle of deeply trusted associates to maintain operations and to relay his instructions and decisions from prison back to the organization on the outside. This period of incarceration reveals something important about the true nature of Raymond's power and influence, because remarkably, despite being physically removed from the streets of Providence, despite sitting in a prison cell rather than his familiar office above the vending machine company, Raymond continued to exercise significant control over his criminal empire. Visitors came to see him in prison, ostensibly as family and friends paying respects to an incarcerated relative, but in reality often serving as messengers, carrying instructions and receiving reports on the state of operations back in Rhode Island. This continued influence from behind bars stood as remarkable testament to just how deeply Raymond's authority had become embedded in the structure of New England organized crime, an authority that imprisonment alone could not fully sever. Raymond's time in prison during this period was not without its own dangers and dramas. Prison environments, particularly for organized crime figures, present their own unique set of challenges, the need to maintain respect and authority among fellow inmates, some of whom might be affiliated with rival criminal organizations or might simply see an opportunity to make a name for themselves by challenging a famous boss now stripped of his usual protections. Raymond navigated this environment with the same careful, calculating approach that had defined his entire career, maintaining his authority through a combination of respect earned over decades in the underworld and the implicit understanding that his reach, even from within prison walls, remained significant enough that crossing him carried serious risk. Raymond was released from prison in 1975, having served a portion of his original sentence, and his return to Providence was watched with intense interest both by his own organization and by the law enforcement agencies that had worked for years to put him behind bars in the first place. What they found, upon his release, was a Raymond Patriarca who had, if anything, emerged from his prison experience with his authority largely intact, a testament to the extraordinary loyalty and discipline he had cultivated within his organization over the decades, and to the careful succession planning he had orchestrated during his years of incarceration. But the world Raymond returned to in 1975 was not quite the same world he had left in 1970. The landscape of American organized crime was shifting in fundamental ways. Federal law enforcement capabilities continued to expand and sophisticate, particularly with the passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, in 1970, a piece of legislation that would eventually prove to be one of the most devastating legal tools ever deployed against organized crime figures, allowing prosecutors to charge entire criminal organizations as ongoing criminal enterprises rather than pursuing individual crimes one at a time. RICO represented an existential threat to the very model of organized crime that Raymond had spent his career perfecting, a model built on insulating the boss from direct involvement in any single provable crime, relying instead on the broader structure of loyalty, fear, and mutual benefit that RICO was specifically designed to unravel. Raymond, upon his release, found himself operating in an environment where the old rules that had protected him for so long were becoming increasingly unreliable. Informants, faced with the harsh sentencing possibilities that RICO enabled, became increasingly willing to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences or entry into the newly developed Witness Protection Program, which offered previously unimaginable safety guarantees to those willing to testify against their former criminal associates. This new willingness to cooperate represented perhaps the single greatest threat to organized crime's traditional code of silence, the omerta that had protected men like Raymond for generations, because it offered a genuine alternative to the fear-based loyalty that had previously kept criminal organizations from unraveling. Throughout the late 1970s, Raymond worked to rebuild and reassert his authority over an organization that had, by necessity, developed somewhat more decentralized patterns of operation during his years away. He returned to his familiar patterns, the modest office, the careful cultivation of relationships, the quiet exercise of authority that had always characterized his leadership style. But those who knew him during this period, including federal investigators who continued their surveillance operations with undiminished intensity, noted subtle changes in Raymond himself. The years in prison, combined with the simple passage of time, Raymond was now approaching 70 years old, had taken a visible toll. He moved more slowly. His health, which had never been particularly robust, showed increasing signs of strain, complications that stemmed in part from long-standing heart problems that would eventually play a significant role in the final chapter of his life. And yet, despite these physical limitations, despite the increasing sophistication of the federal investigative apparatus arrayed against him, despite the shifting cultural and legal landscape that made the old model of organized crime increasingly untenable, Raymond Patriarca continued to command respect and authority throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. He remained, by the assessment of virtually every law enforcement agency tracking organized crime in the Northeast, the single most powerful organized crime figure in all of New England, a boss whose authority extended from the docks of Providence to the financial districts of Boston, whose influence touched everything from small-scale numbers running to sophisticated financial fraud schemes that exploited the increasingly complex modern American economy. This continued dominance, even as the world around him transformed in ways that should have made his position increasingly precarious, speaks to something essential about Raymond Patriarca that separated him from so many of his criminal contemporaries throughout American history. He was not merely a violent man who had seized power through brute force and maintained it through fear alone, though violence and fear certainly played their role in his reign. He was, perhaps above all else, an extraordinarily skilled organizational leader, a man who understood instinctively the principles of loyalty, discipline, and strategic patience that allow any organization, legitimate or criminal, to survive and thrive across changing circumstances and shifting external pressures. He had built something that was, in its own dark way, genuinely resilient, an organization capable of weathering his own imprisonment, capable of adapting to new legal threats, capable of maintaining its core structure and profitability even as the broader landscape of American organized crime crumbled around it in other cities, torn apart by the very RICO prosecutions and cooperating witnesses that Raymond himself would eventually have to contend with in the final years of his life. But even the most carefully constructed empires cannot escape entirely the passage of time, the accumulation of legal pressure, and the inevitable erosion that comes when an aging boss must eventually confront the question of succession, a question that would become increasingly urgent as the 1980s dawned, bringing with it new federal prosecutorial strategies specifically designed to finally, definitively bring down the man who had eluded serious legal consequence for the better part of 5 decades. The final chapter of Raymond Patriarca's reign was approaching, and it would test everything he had built, his organization's loyalty, his own physical endurance, and the very legacy he hoped to leave behind on the streets of Federal Hill that had shaped him from the very beginning. There is a particular kind of danger that comes to men who have survived too long in a world built on the assumption that they will not. By the early 1980s, Raymond Patriarca had done what almost no organized crime boss of his generation had managed to do. He had ruled for nearly 3 decades, survived a prison sentence without losing his throne, and watched countless rivals, subordinates, and law enforcement adversaries come and go while he remained, stubbornly, exactly where he had always been, the quiet, immovable center of New England's criminal underworld. But longevity in this business breeds its own particular vulnerabilities. The longer a man survives at the top, the more time investigators have to study him, the more informants accumulate who once passed through his orbit, and the more the accumulated weight of a lifetime's worth of criminal activity threatens to finally catch up with him in ways that no single conviction ever could. The early 1980s brought with them a new and far more dangerous phase in the federal government's campaign against Raymond Patriarca, one built not around isolated prosecutions for individual crimes, but around the systematic, patient application of the RICO statute that had been steadily reshaping the landscape of organized crime prosecution since its passage in 1970. Federal prosecutors in Boston and Providence, working in increasingly close coordination with the FBI's organized crime units, had spent years methodically building what they hoped would be the definitive case against Raymond, not a narrow conspiracy charge tied to a single murder, as had been used against him in 1968. But a sweeping racketeering indictment designed to expose and dismantle the entire structure of the Patriarca crime family in one decisive legal blow. Central to this new prosecutorial strategy was the FBI's increasingly aggressive use of electronic surveillance. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, federal agents had worked to secure court authorization for wiretaps targeting locations closely associated with Raymond and his top lieutenants, including, most significantly, the small, unassuming office above the vending machine company on Federal Hill that had served as Raymond's base of operations for the better part of 3 decades. For years, Raymond had operated under the assumption, reinforced by his own habitual caution, that this office was likely compromised in some fashion, and he had adjusted his communication patterns accordingly, relying heavily on cryptic language, trusted intermediaries, and face-to-face conversations conducted while walking outdoors, away from any location that might reasonably be expected to house a hidden microphone. But even Raymond's legendary caution could not fully insulate him from the sheer scale and sophistication of the surveillance operation being conducted against him during this period. FBI technicians had become increasingly skilled at the delicate, dangerous work of installing hidden recording devices in locations frequented by organized crime figures, and throughout the early 1980s, agents worked to develop and execute a plan to place a listening device directly within Raymond's Federal Hill office, an operation that, if successful, promised to provide investigators with an unprecedented, direct window into the actual conversations and decision-making processes of New England's most powerful crime boss. The operation succeeded. In April 1981, FBI agents successfully installed a hidden microphone within the office, and for a period of several months, federal investigators were able to record conversations between Raymond and his associates, conversations that, unlike the circumstantial evidence and second-hand informant testimony that had characterized so much of the case building against him in previous decades, offered direct, damning evidence of Raymond's ongoing role in directing and authorizing criminal activity throughout his organization. This bug, planted in the very heart of Raymond's inner sanctum, would prove to be one of the most consequential pieces of evidence ever gathered against an American organized crime boss, and it represented exactly the kind of breakthrough that federal prosecutors had been seeking for years. The recordings captured during this surveillance operation revealed the granular, day-to-day reality of how Raymond actually ran his criminal empire, conversations about gambling debts, about disputes between associates that required his personal arbitration, about the movement of money and the resolution of conflicts that might, left unaddressed, spiral into the kind of violence that Raymond had spent his entire career trying to minimize and control. What emerges from these recordings, according to later accounts from investigators and prosecutors who reviewed them extensively, is a portrait of a man who remained, even in his 70s, remarkably sharp and engaged in the details of his organization's operations, a boss who continued to personally adjudicate disputes, continued to make decisions about which associates could be trusted with particular responsibilities, and continued to exercise the kind of granular control over his criminal empire that had always been the hallmark of his leadership style. This surveillance breakthrough coincided with, and was significantly reinforced by, an increasing willingness among lower-level members of organized crime networks throughout New England to cooperate with federal investigators, a trend that reflected the broader national shift in how organized crime prosecutions were being conducted throughout this era. The combination of RICO's severe sentencing provisions and the increasingly robust protections offered by the Federal Witness Protection Program had created powerful incentives for men who might, in an earlier era, have remained stubbornly loyal to the code of silence that had protected organized crime for generations, to instead consider cooperation as a genuinely viable path forward for themselves and their families. Among the most significant of these cooperating witnesses during this period were individuals who had operated at various levels within or adjacent to the Patriarca organization, men who possessed detailed knowledge of the organization's structure, its criminal activities, and crucially, Raymond's own direct involvement in authorizing and directing that activity. Their testimony, combined with the recordings obtained through the Federal Hill Office surveillance, began to construct exactly the kind of comprehensive, multi-layered case that RICO prosecutions were specifically designed to enable, a case that treated the Patriarca organization not as a series of isolated criminal incidents, but as a single, ongoing criminal enterprise, with Raymond positioned unambiguously at its head. The pressure this mounting legal case placed on Raymond throughout the early 1980s was immense, and it arrived at a particularly difficult moment in his personal life. Raymond's health, which had been a concern for years, began to deteriorate more seriously during this period. He suffered from significant heart problems, a condition that had plagued him for much of his adult life and that grew increasingly severe as he aged into his 70s. Contemporary accounts from this period describe a man who, while still commanding tremendous respect and authority within his organization, was visibly struggling with the physical toll of both his advancing age and the relentless stress of operating at the center of an increasingly intense law enforcement campaign specifically designed to finally bring him to justice after decades of relative impunity. It was against this backdrop of intensifying legal pressure and declining health that Raymond faced what would become one of the most significant prosecutions of his later career. In 1984, Raymond Patriarca was indicted, along with numerous associates, on racketeering charges connected to the broader RICO case that federal prosecutors had spent years building against the organization. This indictment represented the culmination of the extensive surveillance and informant cultivation efforts that had characterized the federal government's approach throughout the early 1980s, and it threatened Raymond with the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence that, given his advanced age and declining health, could very well have amounted to a de facto life sentence. The prospect of standing trial again, at nearly 80 years old, facing what amounted to the most comprehensive and well-evidenced case ever assembled against him, placed Raymond in an extraordinarily difficult position. Throughout his long career, he had always managed to find a path through even the most serious legal threats, through some combination of witness intimidation, corrupted officials, legal maneuvering, and simple luck. He had avoided the kind of definitive, career-ending conviction that had befallen so many of his contemporaries in organized crime. But the case being built against him in the early 1980s was different in both scale and quality from anything he had faced before, and there is substantial evidence, from later accounts of those close to him during this period, that Raymond himself understood the gravity of the threat he now faced. Yet even as the legal net tightened around him, Raymond continued to exercise the same careful, strategic thinking that had defined his entire career. He worked with his legal team to explore every possible avenue of defense, while simultaneously working to ensure that his organization would be prepared to continue functioning regardless of the outcome of his own personal legal battles. This period reveals, perhaps more clearly than any other in Raymond's long career, the extent to which he had come to think of himself not merely as an individual criminal seeking to avoid personal consequence, but as the steward of an institution, an organization that had taken decades to build and that he was determined to preserve, in whatever form possible, regardless of his own personal fate. The question of succession, always a delicate and dangerous topic within any organized crime hierarchy, became increasingly pressing during this period. Raymond's son, Raymond J. Patriarca Jr., had been gradually rising in prominence within the organization throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, and there was growing speculation, both within law enforcement circles and within the organization itself, that the younger Patriarca was being groomed to eventually inherit his father's position. This dynamic added yet another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation, as Raymond had to balance the immediate demands of his own legal defense with longer-term considerations about ensuring a stable transition of power that would preserve the organization's structure and minimize the kind of internal power struggles that had destroyed so many other criminal enterprises following the death or incapacitation of a longtime boss. Throughout 1984 and into 1985, as the racketeering case against him moved through the legal system, Raymond's physical condition continued to decline. His heart problems, in particular, became an increasingly serious concern, and there were periods during this legal battle when questions arose about whether Raymond would even be physically capable of standing trial, given the severity of his cardiovascular condition. This medical uncertainty added yet another dimension to an already complex legal and organizational crisis, as prosecutors, defense attorneys, and Raymond's own associates all grappled with the very real possibility that time itself, rather than any legal verdict, might ultimately determine the final chapter of Raymond Patriarca's extraordinary criminal career. It is worth pausing here to consider the broader significance of what was happening to Raymond during this period, because it reflects a pattern that would play out across organized crime more broadly throughout the 1980s, a decade that, in retrospect, represented perhaps the single most devastating period in the history of American organized crime prosecution. The tools that federal investigators had spent decades developing, sophisticated electronic surveillance, the RICO statute's powerful racketeering provisions, and the increasingly robust witness protection program that made cooperation a genuinely viable option for even hardened criminals, were finally converging in ways that made the kind of decades-long impunity Raymond had enjoyed throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and much of the 1970s increasingly impossible for organized crime figures of any generation to replicate. Raymond Patriarca, in this sense, represented something of a transitional figure, a boss who had built his entire career and reputation during an era when organized crime could operate with a degree of insulation from law enforcement that would become almost unimaginable by the time his own career was drawing to its close. He had witnessed, over the course of his 5-decade criminal career, the entire evolution of American law enforcement's approach to organized crime, from the early decades of relative institutional indifference and denial, through the gradual awakening triggered by events like the Appalachian Meeting, through the aggressive expansion of federal resources and legal tools under Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, and finally into the RICO era that would ultimately prove capable of dismantling even the most carefully constructed and deeply entrenched criminal organizations. As 1985 progressed, the legal proceedings against Raymond continued to grind forward, even as his health continued to deteriorate. Those close to him during this final period of his active involvement in the case describe a man who remained, despite his physical frailty, mentally sharp and deeply engaged in the strategic questions facing both his own defense and the broader future of his organization. He continued to meet with his most trusted associates, continued to offer guidance and direction on matters both large and small, and continued to project, even in the face of his most serious legal and physical challenges, the same quiet, controlled demeanor that had characterized his entire reign atop New England's criminal underworld. But time, as it does for every man regardless of the power and authority he has accumulated over a lifetime, was running out. The combination of advanced age, serious cardiovascular disease, and the relentless stress of facing what promised to be the most significant legal battle of his entire career was taking a toll that no amount of strategic cunning or organizational discipline could fully counteract. Raymond Patriarca, the quiet king who had ruled New England's underworld for the better part of 3 decades, who had survived prison, survived countless legal challenges, survived the deaths and betrayals of rivals and associates alike, was approaching the final chapter of his extraordinary life, a chapter that would arrive not through the dramatic violence that had claimed so many of his criminal contemporaries, nor through the definitive legal defeat that federal prosecutors had spent years working to secure, but through the simple, inexorable biology of a heart that had carried him through decades of stress, danger, and relentless ambition, and that was, finally, beginning to fail. There is a peculiar irony that attaches itself to men who spend their entire lives evading the consequences of violence, only to find themselves finally cornered not by a rival's bullet or a prosecutor's verdict, but by the quiet, indifferent machinery of their own failing bodies. Raymond Patriarca had survived Prohibition-era gang wars, had survived a decade of federal surveillance intensifying around him like a slowly tightening noose, had survived prison and returned to reclaim his throne, had survived hidden microphones planted in the very walls of his own office. But by the middle of the 1980s, the man who had outmaneuvered so many human adversaries found himself facing an opponent against which all his legendary cunning, all his careful strategic patience, could offer no real defense: his own heart, worn down by more than 7 decades of stress, secrecy, and the relentless psychological weight of a life spent at the absolute center of organized crime's most dangerous currents. By early 1984, Raymond's cardiovascular condition had become a matter of serious and growing concern among those closest to him. He had suffered from heart problems for years, a condition that, according to later court filings and medical assessments connected to his ongoing legal battles, had progressively worsened throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. This was not a sudden crisis but a slow, grinding decline, the kind of chronic illness that forces a man to confront, in the most intimate and unavoidable way possible, the reality of his own mortality even as he continues to grapple with the external pressures bearing down on him from every direction. The racketeering case pending against him added an almost unbearable layer of stress to an already precarious medical situation. Throughout 1984, as federal prosecutors continued building and refining their case, Raymond's legal team found themselves increasingly forced to grapple not just with questions of guilt or innocence, evidence or procedure, but with the far more fundamental question of whether their client would even survive to see the case through to its conclusion. Court documents from this period reveal a defense strategy that leaned heavily on Raymond's declining health, arguing that the stress and physical demands of a lengthy trial could pose genuine danger to a man in his condition, an argument that carried both legal strategic value and, quite plausibly, genuine truth. On July 11, 1984, Raymond Patriarca suffered a massive heart attack. He died that day at his home, at the age of 76, bringing to a close one of the longest and most consequential reigns in the history of American organized crime. The news of his death sent immediate and significant ripples through multiple worlds simultaneously, through the criminal underworld of New England, where the question of succession had been quietly simmering for years but now demanded urgent resolution, through the federal law enforcement community, where investigators and prosecutors who had spent years, in some cases entire careers, working to build a case against Raymond suddenly found their target removed from the equation by causes entirely outside their control, and through the broader public consciousness of Rhode Island and New England, where Raymond Patriarca had become, over the course of his decades-long reign, something approaching a mythological figure, simultaneously feared, whispered about, and in a strange, uncomfortable way, almost respected for the sheer scale and duration of the power he had managed to accumulate and maintain. The death of a major organized crime boss is never a simple or purely private event. It represents, in the brutal calculus of underworld politics, a moment of profound institutional vulnerability, a sudden vacancy at the very top of a hierarchical structure that had been built, quite deliberately, around the singular authority and judgment of one man. For an organization like the Patriarca crime family, which had operated under Raymond's direct or indirect leadership for the better part of 3 decades, his death raised immediate and urgent questions about continuity, about loyalty, and about whether the careful, patient discipline that had characterized the organization throughout Raymond's reign could survive the transition to new leadership. Raymond had, as we discussed in our previous chapter, worked to prepare for this eventuality in the years leading up to his death, gradually elevating his son, Raymond J. Patriarca Jr., into positions of increasing responsibility and visibility within the organization. But the transition from a boss who had spent 5 decades building relationships, cultivating loyalty, and demonstrating through countless small and large decisions that he possessed both the wisdom and the ruthlessness necessary to command absolute respect, to a successor who had inherited his position through lineage rather than through the same grinding, decades-long apprenticeship that had shaped his father, was never going to be a simple or seamless process. In the immediate aftermath of Raymond's death, control of the Patriarca crime family passed to Raymond Jr., though the transition was complicated by numerous factors, including the ongoing federal racketeering case that had originally targeted the elder Patriarca alongside numerous associates, and that now had to be reassessed and restructured in light of the primary target's death. Federal prosecutors, who had spent years building their case with Raymond Sr. as the central figure around whom the entire racketeering conspiracy theoretically revolved, now faced the complex legal and strategic question of how to proceed against the remaining defendants, including Raymond Jr., who found himself thrust into a position of significant legal jeopardy at almost precisely the same moment he found himself inheriting leadership of his father's criminal empire. This convergence of crises, the sudden need to assert authority over an organization accustomed to his father's singular leadership, combined with the immediate and serious threat of federal prosecution, placed Raymond Jr. in an extraordinarily difficult position from the very outset of his tenure as boss. Unlike his father, who had spent decades building organizational loyalty through countless small acts of fairness, generosity, and calculated violence, carefully constructing a reputation that commanded respect through demonstrated competence rather than mere inherited title, Raymond Jr. was forced to establish his authority almost immediately, under conditions of intense legal scrutiny, without the luxury of the gradual, patient relationship building that had characterized his father's own rise to power decades earlier. The federal racketeering case did, in fact, proceed against Raymond Jr. and several other defendants following the elder Patriarca's death, and in 1991, Raymond J. Patriarca Jr. was convicted on racketeering charges connected to his role in the organization, a conviction that reflected both the continuing strength of the federal government's investigative and prosecutorial capabilities in this era, and the genuine difficulty facing anyone who attempted to step into the specific role that Raymond Sr. had occupied for so long, protected by relationships and reputations that could not simply be inherited or transferred to a successor, no matter how carefully that succession had been planned. But before we move too quickly into the aftermath and the complex question of the Patriarca family's fate following Raymond Sr.'s death, it's worth pausing to consider more fully what his death actually meant, not just organizationally, but symbolically, for the broader landscape of American organized crime during this pivotal era. Raymond Patriarca's passing in July 1984 came at a moment when organized crime across the entire country was undergoing a fundamental transformation, as the RICO-era prosecutorial strategies that had been developed and refined throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s began to systematically dismantle criminal organizations that had, in many cases, operated with relative impunity for generations. In New York, the five families were facing their own escalating legal pressures that would culminate, just a year after Raymond's death, in the famous Mafia Commission trial that would result in lengthy prison sentences for numerous major crime bosses. In Chicago, the outfit was similarly under increasing federal pressure. Across the country, the golden era of American organized crime, the era that had allowed men like Raymond Patriarca to build empires that endured for decades, that could weather individual prosecutions and periods of incarceration, that could maintain deep and lasting influence over both criminal and, disturbingly, legitimate political and economic institutions, was drawing to a close, replaced by a new reality in which even the most carefully constructed criminal organizations increasingly found themselves unable to escape the reach of federal law enforcement. Raymond's death, in this sense, represented something of a symbolic bookend to an entire era of American organized crime. He had risen to power during the tail end of Prohibition, had consolidated his authority during the relatively permissive law enforcement environment of the 1940s and early 1950s, had weathered the first serious wave of federal attention that followed the Appalachian Meeting and the Kennedy Justice Department's aggressive anti-organized crime campaigns, and had ultimately died just as the RICO era was reaching its full destructive potential against organized crime nationwide. Few figures in American criminal history had witnessed, over the course of a single career, such a complete transformation in the relationship between organized crime and the American legal system, from an era of relative institutional denial and permissiveness to an era of sophisticated, relentless, and ultimately devastating prosecutorial pressure. The public reaction to Raymond's death, particularly within Rhode Island, reflected the complex and often contradictory feelings that many residents of Providence and the broader New England region had developed toward him over the course of his decades-long reign. Local newspapers, in their coverage of his death, grappled with how to characterize a man who had been, simultaneously, one of the most dangerous and feared criminal figures in the region's history, and, in the eyes of many who had encountered him personally on the streets of Federal Hill, a surprisingly ordinary, even courteous figure, a man who greeted neighbors warmly, who was known to help out local families facing financial hardship, who cultivated, whether through genuine inclination or careful strategic calculation, the image of a respected elder statesman of his community rather than the ruthless crime boss that federal investigators and prosecutors understood him to be. This duality, the gap between Raymond's carefully cultivated public image as a humble, unassuming local businessman, and the far darker reality of the criminal empire he actually commanded, had always been central to his particular genius as an organized crime leader, and it remained a defining feature of how his legacy was discussed and understood in the immediate aftermath of his death. Federal law enforcement officials, speaking to reporters following the news of his passing, generally characterized him in stark terms as one of the most powerful and dangerous organized crime figures in American history, a man whose criminal enterprise had caused untold harm through decades of gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and violence. But many residents of Federal Hill, and of Providence more broadly, remembered him rather differently, as a fixture of their community, a man who had lived among them for decades, whose office they passed on their daily walks, whose presence had become so woven into the fabric of ordinary neighborhood life that his death felt, to some, less like the fall of a criminal kingpin and more like the passing of an elder who had simply always been there. This tension between public perception and underlying reality speaks to something profound about how organized crime actually functions within communities, and about the particular skill that separated Raymond Patriarca from so many of his more flamboyant, more publicly notorious criminal contemporaries throughout American history. He had understood, from the very earliest days of his criminal apprenticeship on the streets of Providence, that true power required not just fear, but a kind of embedded legitimacy, a sense, cultivated carefully over decades, that he was not an outside predator preying upon his community, but rather an integral, almost paternal figure within it, someone who provided a kind of rough justice and order in a world where legitimate institutions had often failed the immigrant communities from which he and so many of his associates had originally come. In the weeks and months following his death, as the Patriarca organization worked to navigate the complex transition to new leadership under Raymond Jr., federal investigators and prosecutors continued their efforts to dismantle what remained of the criminal infrastructure that the elder Patriarca had spent his entire adult life constructing. The racketeering case that had originally targeted him proceeded against his remaining co-defendants, providing prosecutors with an opportunity to publicly document, in exhaustive legal detail, the full scope and structure of the criminal enterprise that Raymond had commanded, creating, in effect, a kind of posthumous legal reckoning that, while it could no longer result in Raymond's personal conviction or imprisonment, served to definitively establish, in the public record and in the annals of American organized crime history, the true nature and scale of the empire he had built. This period also revealed the genuine fragility that had always underlain even the most seemingly permanent criminal empires, a fragility that Raymond himself, with his characteristic strategic awareness, had likely understood better than almost anyone else in his organization. Criminal empires, unlike legitimate business enterprises, cannot rely on formal legal structures, cannot pass smoothly from one generation of leadership to the next through orderly corporate succession processes, cannot appeal to courts or regulatory bodies to resolve internal disputes. They depend, fundamentally, on relationships, on personal loyalty, on reputations built through years or decades of demonstrated competence and reliability. And when the central figure around whom all of those relationships and loyalties have been organized suddenly disappears, even the most carefully planned succession can struggle to maintain the same level of authority, the same depth of respect, that the original leader had commanded. Raymond Jr.'s subsequent legal troubles, culminating in his 1991 racketeering conviction, reflected this broader reality. While he inherited his father's title and, to a significant degree, his father's organizational structure, he could not simply inherit the decades of carefully cultivated relationships, the deep reservoirs of trust and fear that his father had built through countless individual interactions and decisions over the course of a 50-year criminal career. The federal government, emboldened by its continued success in dismantling organized crime structures throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, pursued the case against Raymond Jr. with the same determination and sophistication that had ultimately, if only symbolically given his father's death, succeeded in building an overwhelming case against the Patriarca organization's leadership structure. By the time Raymond Jr.'s conviction was secured in 1991, the broader landscape of American organized crime had been transformed almost beyond recognition from the world in which Raymond Sr. had first begun his criminal apprenticeship on the streets of Worcester and Providence more than 6 decades earlier. The old model of organized crime, built on decades-long personal relationships, on careful insulation from legal consequence, on a code of silence that had once seemed unbreakable, had been systematically dismantled by a combination of legal innovation, technological advancement in surveillance capabilities, and a fundamental shift in the incentive structures facing organized crime figures who might, in an earlier era, have remained steadfastly loyal to their organizations and their bosses. Raymond Patriarca had lived, and died, at precisely the hinge point of this historic transformation, a man whose life and career spanned the entire arc of 20th-century American organized crime, from its Prohibition-era origins through its mid-century golden age of relative impunity and institutional influence, and finally to the beginning of its systematic dismantling under the weight of RICO prosecutions and an increasingly sophisticated federal law enforcement apparatus. He had died, in the end, not through violence or through the definitive legal defeat that so many prosecutors had spent careers trying to achieve, but through the simple, inexorable reality of mortality, a reminder that even the most powerful and carefully protected men remain, in the end, subject to the same biological limitations as everyone else. But the story of Raymond Patriarca does not end simply with his death in July 1984. His legacy, the empire he built, the methods he pioneered, the strange, contradictory reputation he left behind as both a feared criminal mastermind and a respected neighborhood fixture, continued to shape New England's criminal landscape for years afterward, even as the organization he had built struggled to survive in an era increasingly hostile to the very model of organized crime he had spent his life perfecting. The final reckoning of that legacy, and the broader question of what Raymond Patriarca's extraordinary life ultimately meant for the history of American organized crime, is where we turn in the chapters that remain. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a criminal empire in the months following the death of the man who built it, not the silence of peace, but the tense, watchful quiet of an organization holding its breath, waiting to see whether the structures of loyalty and fear that had governed it for decades would hold, or whether they would begin, slowly and then all at once, to unravel. In the years following Raymond Patriarca's death in July 1984, that is precisely the drama that played out across the criminal landscape of New England, a slow-motion reckoning with the fundamental question of what happens to an empire once its architect is gone, and whether anything built on the particular genius of one man can ever truly survive his absence. Raymond J. Patriarca Jr. inherited not merely his father's title, but an extraordinarily complicated set of circumstances that would have tested even the most capable successor. He was, by most accounts from those who observed him during this period, a markedly different kind of man than his father had been, someone who had grown up in relative comfort compared to his father's hardscrabble immigrant childhood in Worcester, someone who had not spent decades clawing his way up through the brutal apprenticeship of street-level criminal enterprise that had shaped the elder Patriarca's entire worldview and leadership style. This is not to say that Raymond Jr. lacked criminal experience or capability. He had been groomed for leadership for years and possessed a genuine understanding of the organization's operations. But he faced the almost impossible task of stepping into a role that had been defined, for nearly 3 decades, by one specific man's particular blend of patience, discipline, and carefully cultivated relationships that could not simply be transferred through inheritance, no matter how thoroughly the succession had been planned. The federal racketeering case that had originally targeted Raymond Sr. alongside numerous associates continued to grind forward following his death, now recalibrated to focus on the remaining defendants, including his son. This legal pressure arrived at precisely the moment when Raymond Jr. most needed to demonstrate strength and stability to an organization watching closely for any sign of weakness in its new leadership. The parallel crises, establishing organizational authority while simultaneously fighting for his own freedom in federal court, created a genuinely precarious situation, one that many students of organized crime history would later point to as a textbook example of how difficult succession becomes for criminal organizations that lack the formal legal mechanisms available to legitimate institutions. Throughout the mid to late 1980s, the Patriarca organization under Raymond Jr.'s leadership continued to operate, maintaining significant influence over gambling, loan sharking, and other criminal enterprises throughout Rhode Island and into parts of Massachusetts and Connecticut. But observers within both law enforcement and the criminal underworld itself increasingly noted subtle shifts in how the organization functioned compared to the elder Patriarca's era. The extraordinary discipline that Raymond Sr. had enforced, the near-total insulation from public visibility, the careful avoidance of the kind of flashy, attention-drawing behavior that had doomed so many other organized crime figures, began to show signs of erosion. This was not a sudden or dramatic collapse, but rather the kind of gradual organizational drift that so often occurs when the specific individual whose personal discipline had held a structure together is no longer present to enforce that discipline directly. Compounding these internal challenges was the continued, relentless pressure from federal and state law enforcement agencies, who had learned valuable lessons from their decades-long pursuit of Raymond Sr. and who now applied those lessons with even greater sophistication against his successor organization. The RICO prosecutions that had begun reshaping organized crime nationwide throughout the 1980s continued to intensify throughout the early 1990s, and Rhode Island and Massachusetts law enforcement, having spent years developing informant networks and surveillance capabilities specifically targeting the Patriarca organization, were well positioned to press their advantage against a leadership structure that lacked the elder Patriarca's decades of carefully cultivated protective relationships. Raymond Jr.'s 1991 conviction on racketeering charges represented a significant blow to the organization's stability, though it did not, in itself, mark the complete collapse of the Patriarca crime family's influence in New England. Following his conviction and subsequent imprisonment, leadership of the organization passed through a series of transitions that reflected the broader instability that had come to characterize organized crime structures across the country during this era. Various figures rose to positions of prominence within what remained of the New England Mafia structure throughout the 1990s, but none of them managed to achieve anything approaching the singular, region-spanning authority that Raymond Sr. had commanded at the height of his power. This gradual diminishment of the Patriarca organization's influence throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s reflected a broader national pattern that was playing out in cities across America during this same period. The combination of RICO prosecutions, increasingly sophisticated electronic surveillance capabilities, and a criminal justice system that had become far more effective at incentivizing cooperation among organized crime figures facing lengthy prison sentences, had fundamentally altered the calculus that had once made careers like Raymond Sr.'s possible. The old model, patient relationship building over decades, careful insulation from direct legal exposure, deep cultivation of corrupt relationships with local law enforcement and political figures, had become increasingly difficult to sustain in an environment of relentless federal scrutiny and diminishing loyalty among criminal associates facing the very real possibility of decades-long prison sentences. It is worth pausing here to consider what actually made Raymond Patriarca Sr. such an extraordinary and, in many ways, unrepeatable figure in the history of American organized crime. His career spanned an era of American history that offered opportunities and conditions that simply would not exist again for any subsequent generation of organized crime figures. He had come of age during Prohibition, when the federal government's attempt to legislate morality created enormous criminal opportunities that could be exploited by ambitious young men willing to take the necessary risks. He had consolidated his power during the 1940s and 1950s, an era when federal law enforcement attention to organized crime remained inconsistent and often actively obstructed by institutional denial at the highest levels of the FBI. He had weathered the first serious wave of federal pressure during the 1960s with a combination of careful discipline and, when discipline alone proved insufficient, a willingness to serve prison time rather than compromise the broader integrity of his organization. And he had managed, even as the RICO era began systematically dismantling organized crime structures across the country throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, to maintain his position and authority until the very end of his natural life, dying not in prison, not through violence, but peacefully enough, at home, having outlasted virtually every prosecutorial effort ever mounted against him. This combination of circumstances, the specific historical moment in which he operated, combined with his own particular genius for patient, disciplined leadership, made Raymond Patriarca Sr. something close to a unique figure in American criminal history. Other organized crime bosses of his era achieved comparable levels of wealth or, in some cases, even greater public notoriety. But few, if any, matched the sheer duration of his reign, the completeness of his control over an entire multi-state region, or the remarkable degree to which he managed to insulate himself from definitive legal consequence across 5 full decades of continuous criminal activity. The legacy of this achievement, however, is far from simple or uncomplicated. It would be a mistake, and a serious one, to romanticize what Raymond Patriarca actually built and sustained throughout his career. Behind the careful discipline, behind the quiet demeanor and the cultivated image of a humble neighborhood businessman, lay an organization responsible for enormous harm inflicted on countless individuals and communities throughout New England across more than 3 decades. The gambling operations that generated so much of his organization's wealth preyed disproportionately on working-class families, trapping vulnerable individuals in cycles of debt and desperation. The loan sharking operations that formed another pillar of his criminal empire extracted crushing interest payments from people already facing financial hardship, enforced through implicit and sometimes explicit threats of violence. And the violence itself, the murders, the beatings, the intimidation that maintained order within his organization and eliminated threats to his authority, represented real human suffering, real families torn apart by violence that served, ultimately, the accumulation of power and wealth for a relatively small circle of criminal associates. Understanding Raymond Patriarca's historical significance, then, requires holding 2 truths simultaneously in mind. On one hand, his career represents a genuinely remarkable case study in organizational leadership, strategic patience, and the careful cultivation of power and influence across an extraordinarily long span of time, qualities that, in a legitimate context, might have made him a celebrated business leader or political figure. On the other hand, the actual substance of what he built and sustained throughout his career was a criminal enterprise that inflicted real and lasting harm on the communities it operated within, an enterprise built fundamentally on exploitation, intimidation, and violence, however carefully that violence was managed and concealed from public view. This duality is, in many ways, what makes Raymond Patriarca such a compelling and enduring figure of historical fascination, particularly within the specific context of Rhode Island and New England history. He occupies a unique space in the region's collective memory, simultaneously a symbol of genuine criminal danger and harm, and a kind of folkloric figure whose careful, understated approach to power stood in such sharp contrast to the flashier, more self-destructive gangster archetypes that have dominated American popular culture. Federal Hill itself, the neighborhood that served as the backdrop for so much of his career, continues to carry echoes of this history, even as the neighborhood has transformed in the decades since his death into a thriving, popular destination for restaurants and nightlife, its darker criminal history increasingly relegated to historical curiosity rather than lived reality for the vast majority of residents and visitors who walk its streets today. The broader historical significance of Raymond Patriarca's career also extends into the realm of American legal and law enforcement history, where his case, spanning as it did the entire evolution of federal organized crime prosecution from the era of institutional denial through the RICO Revolution, provides a uniquely comprehensive window into how American institutions gradually developed the tools and strategies necessary to combat organized crime effectively. The surveillance techniques refined during the campaign against Raymond, the prosecutorial strategies developed and tested against his organization, the informant cultivation approaches that eventually helped crack open his organization's internal structure, all of these represented genuine innovations in American law enforcement capability, innovations that would go on to be applied against organized crime structures across the entire country in the years and decades following his death. There is also something worth noting about how Raymond Patriarca's story reflects the broader immigrant experience that shaped so much of 20th-century American organized crime more generally. He was, after all, the son of Italian immigrants who had come to America seeking opportunity and instead found themselves confronting discrimination, economic hardship, and a society that often viewed their community with suspicion and contempt. The path that Raymond ultimately chose, building power and wealth through criminal enterprise rather than through the legitimate channels that were so often effectively closed to Italian immigrants and their children during the early decades of the 20th century, reflects a broader pattern that played out across numerous immigrant communities throughout American history, from the Irish gangs of the 19th century through the Jewish and Italian organized crime networks of the early 20th century, and beyond. This is not offered as justification or excuse for the harm his criminal activities caused, but rather as necessary context for understanding the broader social and historical forces that shaped the environment in which a young man like Raymond Patriarca came of age and made the choices that would define the rest of his extraordinary life. By the time we reach the present day, more than 4 decades after Raymond Patriarca's death, the organization he built has diminished substantially from its peak influence during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Federal prosecutions throughout the 1990s and 2000s continued to erode what remained of the traditional New England Mafia structure, and while organized crime activity of various forms certainly continues to exist throughout the region, it no longer operates with anything approaching the centralized, region-spanning authority that Raymond commanded at the height of his power. In this sense, Raymond Patriarca's career represents not merely the story of one man's rise and reign, but something closer to the final full flowering of an entire model of American organized crime, a model built on immigrant community insularity, on careful cultivation of corrupt political and law enforcement relationships, and on patient, disciplined leadership that prioritized long-term stability over short-term flash, a model that, in the decades following his death, would prove increasingly impossible to sustain against the modernized, technologically sophisticated law enforcement apparatus that his own long career had, in no small part, helped provoke into existence. The quiet king of Federal Hill left behind, then, not merely a criminal legacy of harm and exploitation, though that legacy is real and should never be minimized or forgotten, but also a kind of historical case study, a life that traces, with remarkable completeness, the entire arc of one of the most significant chapters in American criminal history, from its origins in Prohibition-era opportunity through its mid-century golden age of relative impunity, and finally into its dismantlement under the weight of a legal and law enforcement apparatus that had, by the time of Raymond's death, finally developed the tools necessary to bring even the most carefully constructed criminal empires to account. As we approach the final chapter of this story, we turn now to the broader question of Raymond Patriarca's ultimate legacy, how he is remembered today, what his extraordinary career teaches us about the nature of power and organizational discipline, and what became of the empire, the family, and the neighborhood that were all, in their own ways, permanently shaped by the 50-year reign of the quiet king of New England crime. There is a particular kind of immortality that criminals of Raymond Patriarca's stature achieve, not the immortality of legitimate greatness, not the kind that gets streets named after you or statues erected in your honor, but a stranger, more ambiguous form of permanence that lives in whispered stories, in the collective memory of a neighborhood, in the pages of law enforcement files that continue to be studied by new generations of investigators and historians decades after the man himself has passed from the earth. More than 4 decades have now gone by since Raymond Patriarca's heart finally gave out on that July day in 1984, and yet his name continues to surface, in true crime documentaries, in academic studies of organized crime, in the ongoing folklore of Providence and Rhode Island, and in the very structure of criminal justice reforms that his decades-long evasion of consequence helped inspire. To walk the streets of Federal Hill today is to walk through a landscape still quietly haunted by his presence, even as the neighborhood itself has transformed almost beyond recognition from the world he once commanded. Federal Hill in the 21st century bears little outward resemblance to the neighborhood Raymond Patriarca knew during the height of his power. The working-class Italian-American enclave, with its modest shops and tenement apartments, has evolved into one of Providence's most vibrant dining and entertainment districts, drawing visitors from across New England to sample its renowned Italian restaurants, its lively nightlife, its carefully preserved architectural character that speaks to the neighborhood's deep immigrant roots even as its economic function has shifted dramatically. Yet scattered throughout this transformed landscape remain traces of the old world, the church where generations of Italian immigrant families worshipped, the narrow streets that once hosted the quiet comings and goings of men seeking Raymond's counsel, and, somewhere among the storefronts, the building that once housed the unassuming office above a vending machine company where, for nearly 3 decades, one of America's most powerful organized crime bosses conducted the business of running an empire. The physical traces of Raymond's reign have largely faded, but the psychological and cultural imprint he left on the region has proven far more durable. In Rhode Island particularly, Raymond Patriarca occupies a unique place in local historical memory, one that reflects the broader complexity of how communities process the legacy of organized crime figures who operated within and among them for so many decades. He is remembered, simultaneously and sometimes by the very same individuals, as a genuinely dangerous criminal whose activities caused real harm to real people, and as a kind of folkloric figure whose careful, understated style of power exercised a strange fascination that transcends simple moral categorization. This duality continues to animate popular and academic interest in his story, ensuring that his name resurfaces regularly in discussions of American organized crime history, in documentaries exploring the golden age of the American Mafia, and in the ongoing scholarly effort to understand exactly how organized crime managed to embed itself so deeply into the fabric of American urban life throughout the mid-20th century. For law enforcement and legal scholars, Raymond's career continues to serve as an instructive case study in the evolution of American organized crime prosecution. His 5-decade run atop New England's criminal hierarchy, and the decades-long, multi-generational effort required to finally bring meaningful legal pressure against him, illustrates with unusual clarity just how difficult it was for American institutions to develop effective tools against organized crime during the era when Raymond first rose to power. The techniques eventually used against him and his organization, sophisticated electronic surveillance, the RICO statute's powerful racketeering provisions, and increasingly effective witness protection and cooperation incentives, represent genuine innovations in American law enforcement capability, innovations refined in no small part through the specific, decades-long challenge that Raymond's careful, disciplined organization presented to investigators and prosecutors across multiple generations of federal and state law enforcement careers. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Raymond Patriarca's legacy lies not in the specific criminal enterprises he ran, nor even in the legal and investigative innovations his career helped provoke, but in what his story reveals about the nature of power itself, about how it is built, how it is sustained, and ultimately, how it inevitably, eventually, comes to an end. Raymond understood something that eluded so many of his criminal contemporaries throughout American history, that true, lasting power rarely announces itself with flash and spectacle. It builds quietly, patiently, through the accumulation of countless small relationships and obligations, through a discipline that resists the seductive temptations of visible wealth and public recognition, through the careful cultivation of loyalty that cannot be bought in a single transaction but must instead be earned across years and decades of demonstrated reliability. This is, in its own dark way, a genuinely instructive lesson about organizational leadership and the mechanics of influence, one that extends, in its broader principles if not in its specific criminal application, well beyond the narrow context of organized crime history. Raymond Patriarca built and sustained an empire not through the kind of dramatic, headline-grabbing violence that destroyed so many of his contemporaries, but through the unglamorous, patient work of relationship building, of careful risk management, of maintaining discipline even when circumstances might have tempted a lesser man toward recklessness. He understood that the appearance of humility could be a more powerful shield than any display of wealth, that quiet reliability could command more genuine loyalty than fear alone, and that survival across decades required a kind of strategic patience that few men, in any walk of life, ever truly master. And yet, for all the strategic brilliance that characterized his rise and his remarkably long reign, Raymond Patriarca's story ultimately serves as a sobering reminder of the fundamental fragility that underlies even the most carefully constructed criminal empires. Everything he built, the relationships, the loyalty, the careful insulation from legal consequence that had taken him 5 decades to construct, proved, in the end, impossible to fully transfer to a successor, impossible to preserve intact once the singular individual around whom it had all been organized was no longer present to sustain it through his own personal discipline and judgment. Within less than a decade of his death, the organization he had spent his entire adult life building had begun a decline from which it would never fully recover, a decline that mirrored the broader collapse of traditional organized crime structures across the entire country during this same pivotal era in American criminal justice history. There is something almost Shakespearean in the arc of this story, a man who rises from genuine hardship and poverty through sheer force of will, patience, and calculated ruthlessness, who builds something that seems, for decades, to be genuinely permanent and unassailable, who survives threat after threat, prosecution after prosecution, betrayal after betrayal, only to discover, in the end, That the empire he built was always, fundamentally, contingent on his own continued presence and judgment, that no amount of careful planning or succession preparation could fully guarantee its survival once he himself was gone. This is, in many ways, the oldest story in human history, told across countless kingdoms and empires throughout the centuries. The throne endures only as long as the particular genius of the man who built it remains present to sustain it, and once he is gone, even the most carefully constructed institutions begin, almost immediately, the slow process of dissolution. Raymond Salvatore Patriarca died as he had largely lived, quietly, without the dramatic violence that claimed so many of his contemporaries, without the definitive courtroom defeat that so many prosecutors across 5 decades had worked so hard to achieve, but through the simple, universal reality of mortality that comes, eventually, for every human being regardless of the power, wealth, or fear they have managed to accumulate across a lifetime. He left behind a complicated legacy, genuine harm inflicted on countless individuals and families across New England through decades of gambling exploitation, loan sharking, extortion, and violence, alongside a strange, enduring fascination that continues to draw historians, journalists, filmmakers, and true crime enthusiasts to his story more than 4 decades after his death. What are we to make, then, of a life like Raymond Patriarca's, a life that defies easy moral categorization, that combines genuine criminal harm with a kind of grudging, uncomfortable respect for the sheer discipline and strategic patience that allowed him to survive and thrive for so long in one of the most dangerous and unforgiving professions imaginable? Perhaps the most honest answer is that we are not meant to resolve this tension neatly, that the enduring fascination with figures like Raymond Patriarca stems precisely from their resistance to simple categorization as either purely monstrous villains or admirable, if flawed, figures of strategic genius. He was, in the end, both of these things simultaneously, a man capable of ordering violence against those who threatened his authority, and a man capable of building genuine loyalty and even affection among those who knew him personally, a man whose criminal enterprises caused real and lasting harm to his community, and a man who was, by many contemporary accounts, genuinely embedded in and even beloved by that same community in ways that complicate any simple narrative of predator and victim. This complexity is, perhaps, the truest legacy that Raymond Patriarca leaves behind, not a simple morality tale about crime and punishment, but a genuinely difficult, uncomfortable case study in how power actually functions in the real world, how criminal enterprises embed themselves within legitimate community structures, and how the line between feared outlaw and respected community fixture can become, in the hands of a sufficiently skilled and patient operator, far more blurred than popular imagination typically allows. The quiet king of Federal Hill built something that, for the better part of 3 decades, seemed almost untouchable, and in doing so, he taught American law enforcement invaluable lessons about exactly what it would take to finally, definitively confront organized crime as a genuine national institutional threat, lessons that would shape federal prosecutorial strategy for generations to come, long after the small office above the vending machine company had been emptied of its final secrets. Today, when new investigators study the history of American organized crime, when documentary filmmakers seek to understand how the Mafia actually functioned at the height of its influence in American life, when historians attempt to trace the complex, often uncomfortable relationship between immigrant communities and the criminal enterprises that sometimes grew up within them, they inevitably find their way back to Raymond Patriarca, to the boy from Worcester who learned the hard lessons of Federal Hill's unforgiving streets, who built an empire through patience rather than spectacle, who ruled for nearly 3 decades from a room so unremarkable that visitors were often surprised to learn it housed the operational headquarters of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history, and who died, finally, not through the violence that had claimed so many of his rivals and contemporaries, but through the simple, universal mortality that comes, eventually, for every man, regardless of the throne he once occupied. The story of Raymond Patriarca is, in the end, a story about the true nature of power, about how it is built through patience rather than spectacle, sustained through discipline rather than fear alone, and ultimately, inevitably, proven finite regardless of how carefully it is constructed or how long it manages to endure. It is a story that reminds us, uncomfortably, that the most dangerous figures in our history are rarely the loudest or the most visible, but often the quietest, the most patient, the the most carefully disciplined, the ones who understand, with a clarity that eludes so many of their more flamboyant contemporaries, that true power lies not in being feared for what you might do, but in being trusted, respected, and quietly obeyed by everyone who understands, without ever needing to be told directly exactly what you are capable of. Raymond Patriarca ruled New England's underworld for the better part of 5 decades without ever needing to raise his voice, without ever needing to flaunt his wealth or his power, without ever needing anything more than the quiet, unshakable certainty of everyone around him that his word, however softly spoken, carried the absolute weight of life and death. He was, in every meaningful sense, the quiet king, and though his empire did not survive him, though the throne he built ultimately proved as mortal as the man who once sat upon it, his story endures as one of the most remarkable, complex, and instructive chapters in the entire history of American organized crime. If this story of the quiet king of New England crime pulled you into the shadows tonight, if you found yourself walking beside Raymond Patriarca through the streets of Federal Hill, through the decades of patient power and the final, inevitable reckoning that came for him in the end, then make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history. There are countless other stories still waiting in the darkness, other bosses, other empires, other quiet men who built kingdoms out of fear and loyalty and patience, only to watch them rise and fall in the endless, unforgiving arithmetic of the underworld. Like this video if you want more stories like this one, drop a comment and let me know which gangster's story you want told next, and subscribe so you never miss the next descent into the shadows of history's most dangerous men. Until next time, stay in the light, because where we go next, the shadows run deep.